The applause was still echoing off the glass walls of the Grand Crescent Summit Hall when my face filled the 20-foot screen behind Tyler Kingston, and in that exact second I understood what it feels like to be erased while still standing upright. One moment I was a senior operations director at one of the fastest-growing firms in the region, the man who had helped build 3 expansion branches and restructure 2 failing divisions. The next, I was a cautionary slide in a presentation titled Financial Accountability. The hall was dressed for celebration, crystal chandeliers scattering light across polished marble floors, black-draped investor tables glowing under soft gold spotlights, cameras positioned along the walls to stream the event live to thousands of remote shareholders, but as my name appeared in bold white letters beneath the words Primary Responsible Party, the air shifted from festive to predatory. Tyler stood at the podium in a tailored charcoal suit, posture relaxed, voice steady, the kind of composure that convinces people before facts ever have a chance. Leadership, he began smoothly, requires transparency when mistakes are made. His tone was not angry, it was worse than that. It was calm. Controlled. Final. Around the room, heads turned toward me in a synchronized wave, expressions morphing from confusion to curiosity to something dangerously close to relief that it wasn't their face on the screen. Brandon Cole, our CFO, stood off-stage with his hands clasped in front of him, eyes lowered just enough to perform disappointment. Derek Sullivan from Human Resources remained near the back wall, lips pressed thin, already rehearsing neutrality. At the investor table closest to the stage sat Logan Price, a board member known for asking uncomfortable questions, and unlike the others, he wasn't nodding, he was watching. My phone began to vibrate in my pocket, messages, notifications, probably screenshots of the very slide glowing above Tyler's shoulder, but I didn't reach for it. I couldn't. Tyler continued speaking, explaining that procedural negligence under my supervision had exposed the company to unnecessary financial risk. Each phrase was carefully selected, legally insulated, devastating. 8 years condensed into 2 minutes of narrative control. 8 years of 70-hour workweeks, of sleeping in airport lounges between branch audits, of defending budget lines in rooms filled with men who had never stepped inside an operational warehouse, of mentoring junior analysts like Connor Blake who had come in wide-eyed and hungry to learn. 8 years, rewritten as negligence. The presentation advanced to charts stripped of context, transfers without corresponding approvals, expense lines without attached internal memos, timelines truncated so that corrective emails I had sent appeared to come after rather than before flagged discrepancies. It was brilliant, in a way that made my chest tighten. Someone had curated this story with surgical precision. Tyler paused for effect, allowing the silence to expand until even the clinking of silverware stopped. Effective immediately, he said, Jason Whitman has been relieved of his duties pending formal review. Relieved. As though I should be grateful for the mercy of public dismissal instead of immediate termination. Scattered applause followed, hesitant at first, then swelling as social proof took hold. I felt it then, not just humiliation, but displacement, as if the floor beneath my polished shoes had subtly shifted an inch to the left and I was the only one who noticed. Tyler stepped away from the podium and for a fraction of a second his eyes met mine. There was no overt malice there, no theatrical villainy, just a quiet assurance that he believed the narrative was sealed. That look told me 2 things, he thought I would crumble, and he assumed I had nothing. What no one in that room knew, what no one watching the live stream could possibly see, was that this moment had begun 3 months earlier in Tyler's corner office when I carried in a slim folder of irregularities that didn't align. It had started when Connor Blake, a meticulous junior analyst with a habit of double-checking timestamps, hesitantly knocked on my office door and said, "Sir, some of these transfers were authorized after midnight, but the approvals look backdated." It had continued when I traced those transfers to vendor accounts tied to shell entities that Brandon Cole had insisted were part of an aggressive growth strategy. It intensified when legal approvals came back signed by Christian Wells faster than any compliance review should have allowed. I had brought the concerns directly to Tyler then, believing in hierarchy, in process, in the unspoken contract between leadership and truth. I can still see him standing by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the skyline, hands in his pockets, listening without interruption as I outlined the discrepancies. When I finished, he didn't react with alarm, he reacted with calculation. "Jason," he had said softly, "sometimes expansion requires flexibility." Flexibility. The word lingered in the room like a warning disguised as reassurance. When I pressed, when I suggested a third-party audit to protect the company long-term, he turned from the window and offered a smile so measured it felt rehearsed. "Trust the leadership structure," he replied. That was the moment something inside me shifted, not into rebellion, but into awareness. I began copying correspondence, archiving approvals, preserving metadata from financial systems before they could be altered. Not because I wanted to expose anyone, but because experience had taught me that when numbers don't align, narratives eventually form, and narratives require protagonists and scapegoats. Back in the summit hall, as the applause thinned and conversations resumed in hushed clusters, I realized the protagonist of Tyler's story had just been rewritten into a liability. Brandon finally looked up, offering a brief, almost sympathetic nod that did nothing to mask the relief in his posture. Derek was already whispering to someone from legal. Logan Price remained seated, eyes thoughtful, as if measuring whether the explanation he had just witnessed truly balanced the scale of the accusation. I felt heat crawl up my neck but forced my shoulders to remain level. Public humiliation feeds on reaction, it grows when the target flails. So I stood still. Tyler concluded the segment by thanking stakeholders for their continued confidence and inviting them to focus on the company's resilient future. Resilient. Another word that sounded noble while quietly implying that I had been the weakness. As people began to rise from their seats, a few colleagues avoided eye contact entirely while others offered tight smiles that communicated neither support nor condemnation. Phones were out everywhere now, the clip would circulate within minutes. Somewhere, headlines were already drafting themselves. I could feel the weight of reputation dissolving in real time, the way trust erodes not with a crash but with a steady, irreversible slide. And yet beneath the humiliation, beneath the sting of being publicly designated the problem, there was a steadiness I hadn't anticipated. Because the folder I had started compiling months ago no longer felt like paranoia, it felt like foresight. Tyler believed the story ended tonight. He believed that by controlling the first broadcast, he controlled the memory. But as I stepped away from the stage lights and into the shadowed corridor leading toward the exit, I understood something fundamental about power: it depends on silence from those who know differently. The humiliation was real. The damage was immediate. But the truth was intact. And as the summit doors closed behind me and the cool night air replaced the suffocating warmth of orchestrated applause, I made a decision that would carry this story far beyond that ballroom. I would not argue in hallways. I would not leak anonymously. I would not beg for reconsideration. If my name had been placed on a screen before thousands, then the correction would require a screen just as large. They had chosen a stage for my fall. I would choose one for the truth. And that was the moment, not with the accusation, not with the applause, but with the quiet understanding that humiliation is only permanent when you accept the version of yourself written by someone else. The morning after the summit, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating non-stop on the nightstand, and before I even opened my eyes I knew the story had traveled faster than I had. Notifications stacked on the screen in relentless rows. News alerts, missed calls, messages from colleagues who suddenly sounded distant, messages from acquaintances who sounded curious, messages from strangers who sounded certain of my guilt. By the time I sat up in bed, the narrative Tyler Kingston had delivered the night before had already hardened into public perception. Senior director blamed for internal financial breakdown. Executive removed following accountability review. My name was no longer attached to strategy, expansion, or growth. It was attached to collapse. It is strange how quickly years of credibility can be compressed into a single accusation, how efficiently an audience accepts the first explanation it is given. I scrolled through the articles carefully, noting how each one referenced the same phrases Tyler had used: procedural negligence, misallocations, leadership accountability, as though they had all been handed the same script. In a way, they had. I placed the phone face down and walked to my desk, where a slim black drive sat beside a stack of printed emails. Months ago, when Connor Blake had hesitantly brought me those time-stamped discrepancies, I had sensed a current beneath the surface of our financial reports. Connor was not dramatic, he was meticulous. He had noticed that certain vendor approvals were logged at 11:57 p.m., 12:14 a.m., 1:03 a.m., times when neither compliance nor legal typically processed documents. Maybe it's automated, he had suggested at first, unsure of his own suspicion. But automation leaves patterns, and these patterns were inconsistent. I remember opening the system logs with him and seeing digital footprints that didn't align, metadata that indicated edits after approvals, small shifts that most people would dismiss as clerical quirks. I had told him to keep working, to focus on his assigned reports, but that I would look deeper. That was the first thread. When I followed it, it led to vendor accounts linked to Shell subsidiaries that Brandon Cole had classified as accelerated growth partners. On paper, the structure was clever, temporary entities used to manage expansion costs across regions, but the cash flow between them and our primary account seemed unnecessarily convoluted. Funds were routed out, then back in, then out again under revised descriptions. Each time I flagged the anomalies internally, the responses came swiftly and confidently from legal, signed by Christian Wells, assuring that all movements were within approved flexibility margins. Flexibility. The same word Tyler had used when I first brought concerns to him in private. At the time, I wanted to believe that I simply lacked full visibility into the executive strategy. That is how hierarchy protects itself, it convinces you that doubt is ignorance. But doubt has a way of sharpening when it is dismissed too quickly. So I began to document quietly. I exported transaction logs weekly. I archived internal messages that referenced budget shifts. I saved audio from a strategy call where Brandon mentioned temporary reallocations that would normalize after public reporting. None of it was illegal on its face, it was the pattern that troubled me. Patterns reveal intent. The night of the summit, when Tyler projected curated charts that stripped away context, I recognized my own data rearranged into accusation. They had not fabricated numbers, they had isolated them. They had removed the warnings I had sent weeks earlier asking for external review. They had excluded the email in which I wrote, "We need to reconcile these transfers before next quarter's report." They had erased the sequence so that my attempts to question became evidence of involvement. That realization did not make the humiliation easier, but it clarified the battlefield. Now, sitting in my apartment with morning light cutting across the desk, I understood that was not about clearing my name emotionally, it was about reconstructing truth structurally. I powered on my laptop and opened the encrypted archive I had built over the past 3 months. Each file was labeled with dates, cross-referenced with system logs, backed up to 2 separate drives. I had never intended to use them publicly, I had intended them as protection in case regulators ever audited the company and I needed to demonstrate due diligence. But Tyler had accelerated the timeline. By noon, Trevor Hayes's name appeared in my inbox. Subject line, "Off the record?" Trevor was an investigative journalist known for dissecting corporate narratives, and he wrote with cautious directness. "Something about last night's presentation doesn't align with historical performance metrics. If you're willing, I'd like to ask a few questions." I stared at the message longer than necessary. Engaging with the media could make me appear defensive, but silence would cement Tyler's version as definitive. I replied simply, "We can talk." That afternoon we met in a quiet cafe away from the financial district. Trevor did not waste time on sympathy. He asked precise questions about transaction sequencing, about who authorized what and when, about internal audit schedules. I answered carefully, sticking to verifiable facts. When I mentioned the midnight approvals and the edited metadata, his expression sharpened. "Do you have documentation?" he asked. I slid a small printed summary across the table, not the full archive, just enough to demonstrate structure. He read silently, then looked up. "If this holds, the story is bigger than a misallocation." Bigger. That word carried weight. For the first time since the summit, I felt the narrative wobble slightly. Meanwhile, inside the company, reactions were unfolding predictably. Derek Sullivan issued a brief internal memo emphasizing commitment to transparency during review. Brandon Cole remained publicly silent. Tyler gave a short interview reiterating the need for decisive leadership. None of them anticipated resistance because they believed humiliation had neutralized me. What they underestimated was documentation. That evening, Connor called me. His voice carried guilt. "Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't think," I interrupted him gently. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You noticed." He hesitated before adding, "They've restricted access to the transaction logs." That detail confirmed what I suspected: containment mode had begun. I asked him one final question. "Did you ever alter any of the data we reviewed?" "No," he answered immediately. I wouldn't. I believed him. Integrity often reveals itself under pressure, and Connor's voice held none of the tremor of someone hiding involvement. After the call ended, I sat back and considered the architecture of what had happened. Tyler had staged a public reckoning not because the evidence was airtight, but because first impressions anchor belief. By naming me before shareholders and streaming it live, he ensured that any correction would sound like defense rather than revelation. Unless the correction happened on a stage equal in scale. Trevor texted later that night, "Network panel next week on corporate governance. They're inviting Tyler. Interested?" The symmetry was almost poetic. The same mechanism used to frame me, public broadcast, could become the platform to realign the narrative. But this time, preparation would be absolute. I spent the next several days organizing the archive into a timeline impossible to distort. Each transaction paired with its approval metadata. Each email waprinted with headers intact. Each internal memo is annotated with date and distribution list. I built a sequence that demonstrated not just irregularity, but awareness, proof that I had flagged concerns before the transfers escalated. As I worked, the initial sting of humiliation transformed into focus. Anger dissipates quickly. Clarity endures. It was not about revenge, it was about precision. I knew that if I reacted emotionally, I would validate Tyler's framing of me as unstable or defensive. If I reacted methodically, I would shift the terrain entirely. By the end of the week, the folder on my desk was no longer slim. It was deliberate. Structured. Unavoidable. When Trevor confirmed that the live panel would proceed, featuring Tyler Kingston and moderated by Zachary Stone, I felt the final pieces align. Tyler believed he had concluded the story with a slide and a smile. He believed that by isolating data and controlling tone, he had sealed my fate. What he did not account for was the quiet accumulation of context. Humiliation may capture attention, but evidence commands reconsideration. As I closed the final binder and placed the black drive beside it, I realized that the public fall in the ballroom had been only the opening movement. The real narrative was still forming, layer by layer, timestamp by timestamp, waiting for light. And for the first time since my face filled that towering screen, I understood that the story was no longer about defending myself within the company's walls. It was about exposing the architecture of manipulation that had turned diligence into liability. They had chosen speed. I had chosen a structure. And structure, when tested under scrutiny, does not crack easily. By the time the official invitation arrived, I already knew it was coming, but seeing my name printed beneath Tyler Kingston's on the digital event banner made the moment real in a way preparation never could. National Business Forum, Corporate Governance and Accountability, Live. The irony was almost theatrical. A week earlier, I had been publicly labeled the liability. Now I was being invited to sit across from the man who labeled me and discuss integrity in front of a national audience. The network framed it as a balanced dialogue. I recognized it as a calculated spectacle. Tyler would assume I was walking into a second humiliation, a final reinforcement of the narrative he had launched in that chandelier-lit ballroom. He believed proximity to power would intimidate me into caution. What he did not know was that I had spent the last 7 nights building a timeline that could not be rearranged, a structure of documentation so sequential that removing one piece would expose the manipulation of all the others. When I accepted the invitation, I did so without adding a single condition. No demands for speaking time, no pre-approval of topics. Silence can be misinterpreted as weakness, but in strategic moments it is leverage. The days leading up to the broadcast were filled with quiet activity. Trevor Hayes called twice, once to verify that I understood the risk of going live, and again to confirm that his own independent review of certain public filings had revealed discrepancies consistent with what I had shown him. He never promised advocacy, he promised scrutiny. That was enough. Meanwhile, inside the company, containment tightened. Access restrictions increased, and Derek Sullivan circulated a memo reminding employees not to comment publicly on ongoing internal matters. Brandon Cole maintained his composure in interviews, repeating the phrase, "under review," as if repetition alone could transform suspicion into patience. Tyler appeared on a morning segment 2 days before the forum, reiterating that leadership requires decisive action in moments of internal failure. He never mentioned my name again. He didn't need to. It had already been etched into the original narrative. The evening before the broadcast, I sat alone in my apartment reviewing the binder one final time. Each section was tabbed and indexed: transaction sequences, metadata logs, internal warnings, legal fast-track approvals, executive communications. I had rehearsed not what I would say, but what I would not say. I would not speculate. I would not accuse without documentation. I would not allow emotion to distort precision. The objective was not to win a debate, it was to shift reality. The studio the next afternoon was colder than I expected, the kind of artificial chill that keeps equipment from overheating. Technicians moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting lights, testing microphones, counting down segments in low voices. Zachary Stone, the moderator, greeted us with professional neutrality. He shook Tyler's hand first, then mine, offering identical smiles to maintain balance. Tyler looked confident, almost relaxed, as if the setting favored him by default. He leaned back in his chair during pre-show checks, joking lightly with a producer about travel schedules. When his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of recognition, not of guilt, but of anticipation. He expected compliance, perhaps defensiveness. He expected me to defend my reputation with generalities. The red light blinked on. Zachary opened with a measured introduction about the importance of transparency in modern corporations, referencing the recent summit incident as an example of accountability in action. Tyler spoke first, reiterating the storyline with polished restraint. He described difficult decisions, internal reviews, and the burden of leadership when confronting operational missteps. He framed my removal as unfortunate but necessary, emphasizing that organizations must prioritize stability over sentiment. His tone was consistent with the ballroom presentation, calm, assured, authoritative. I listened without interruption, hands resting lightly on the binder in my lap. When Zachary turned to me and asked, "Mr. Whitman, do you accept the findings presented at the summit?" I allowed a brief pause, not for drama, but for composure. "I accept that findings were presented," I replied evenly. "I do not accept that they were complete." Tyler's posture shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Zachary leaned forward. Incomplete how? That was the opening. I placed the binder on the table and opened to the first tab. The transactions referenced during the summit were displayed without their corresponding internal warnings, I said, sliding a printed email toward Zachary. This message was sent 6 weeks before the quarter closed, flagging irregular timestamps and requesting external audit review. Zachary scanned the header. Date visible. Recipients listed. Tyler's expression remained neutral, but the ease in his shoulders tightened. I continued methodically. The approvals shown as authorized under my supervision were processed at 12:14 a.m., 1:03 a.m., and 11:57 p.m., outside standard compliance windows. Here are the system logs demonstrating metadata edits post-approval. I turned the page, aligning the logs with the transaction entries displayed at the summit. And here, I added, are the legal fast-track clearances signed by Christian Wells within hours of those edits. Zachary requested copies for the production team. The control room, visible through the studio glass, stirred with increased motion. Tyler interjected carefully. Jason, you were part of the executive team. Oversight ultimately rests collectively. Oversight requires visibility, I responded calmly. These warnings were escalated. I then opened to the Executive Communications tab and read a line aloud, one that I had rehearsed not for theatrics but for clarity. If regulators request detailed breakdowns, frame discrepancies as operational lag rather than structural misallocation. The email bore Tyler's signature block. Silence settled heavier than any applause ever had. Zachary looked from the document to Tyler. Mr. Kingston, is this authentic? Tyler adjusted his tie. Context matters in executive correspondence, he replied, but the confidence that defined his earlier tone had thinned. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him of fraud. I simply turned to the next page. Here is the timeline, I said, aligning printed pages in chronological order. Internal warning. After-hours approval. Metadata edit. Legal clearance. Public presentation isolating final transaction without preceding sequence. Trevor Hayes appeared via remote feed, confirming that he had independently verified portions of the metadata through public filings and time-stamped disclosures. The cumulative weight of documentation shifted the room's energy. This was no longer a debate of opinions, it was a reconstruction of events. Tyler attempted to redirect, suggesting that complex organizations often experience procedural overlap, but each time he generalized, I countered with specificity. When he emphasized collective responsibility, I acknowledged it while reiterating that collective responsibility does not justify selective omission. The distinction mattered. As the segment progressed, social media feeds displayed on studio monitors began to surge with real-time reactions. Analysts commented on the structured presentation. Legal experts noted the significance of timestamp discrepancies. The narrative that had seemed sealed now fractured under scrutiny. For the first time since the summit, Tyler looked uncertain, not panicked, but recalibrating in real time. Zachary concluded the segment by stating that the network would be reviewing the documentation further and inviting company representatives to provide additional clarification. The red light blinked off. The studio exhaled. Tyler rose from his chair without meeting my eyes, murmuring something to his assistant. I remained seated for a moment longer, not out of fatigue, but out of awareness that the axis had shifted. The humiliation in the ballroom had been swift and unchallenged. This exposure was deliberate and documented. As I left the studio, my phone vibrated again, but this time the messages carried a different tone, questions instead of accusations, reconsideration instead of certainty. Logan Price's name appeared among the notifications. We need to talk. That single line signaled more than support, it signaled inquiry from within the structure that had once accepted the initial narrative. Had not ended with applause or condemnation. It ended with equilibrium disrupted. Tyler had chosen spectacle to establish blame. I had chosen documentation to establish sequence. In doing so, the story transformed from a personal defense into an institutional reckoning. The humiliation had introduced me as the liability. The live broadcast introduced context. And context, once public, cannot be easily withdrawn. The fallout did not explode overnight, it tightened, quietly and relentlessly, like pressure building beneath a sealed surface, and by the third morning after the live broadcast it was clear that the story had moved beyond debate and into consequence. Markets do not respond to emotion, they respond to uncertainty, and uncertainty had entered the bloodstream of the company the moment those timestamp logs were displayed on national television. Analysts began dissecting quarterly reports with renewed aggression, financial blogs mapped transaction patterns in side-by-side comparisons, and investors who had applauded at the summit were now requesting closed-door briefings. The board convened an emergency session led by Logan Price, and this time the tone was not ceremonial, it was investigative. I was not present in that boardroom, but I did not need to be. When narratives fracture publicly, institutions instinctively protect themselves. Tyler Kingston had relied on decisiveness to project stability, but decisiveness without transparency now looked like concealment. Brandon Cole issued a statement describing the irregularities as technical sequencing misunderstandings, yet he declined to answer direct questions about after-hours approvals. Christian Wells withdrew from public comment entirely. Derek Sullivan circulated another internal memo emphasizing cooperation with an independent audit firm that, until that moment, had not been part of the company's plan. The architecture was shifting in real time. That afternoon, Logan called me directly. His voice was measured but different from before, it carried the weight of someone recalibrating assumptions. "We are commissioning a third-party forensic review," he said without preamble. "Your documentation will be included." I acknowledged the decision calmly. There was no triumph in my response, only recognition that process had finally caught up with presentation. When institutions move, they move to preserve legitimacy, not to validate individuals, and I understood that my role now was to remain precise. Over the next week, auditors requested copies of metadata, correspondence, and transaction logs. I provided everything exactly as archived, without commentary beyond clarification. Precision is persuasive when it remains unembellished. Meanwhile, Tyler attempted to maintain public composure. In a brief press conference, he reiterated that he welcomed review and stood by his commitment to accountability. But composure begins to thin when questions multiply faster than prepared statements. During one exchange with a financial correspondent, he was asked directly whether executive communications had advised reframing discrepancies as operational lag. He responded by emphasizing contextual language common in executive strategy, yet the repetition of that phrase only deepened scrutiny. The very calm that had once projected authority now seemed rehearsed. Internally, fissures widened. Connor Blake informed me quietly that system access restrictions had been partially lifted under auditor supervision. That detail mattered because containment strategies dissolve when oversight becomes external. Employees who had remained silent during the summit began forwarding archived communications anonymously to the audit team. It was not rebellion, it was self-preservation. No one wanted to be on record supporting a narrative that might unravel. As days passed, the forensic review uncovered sequencing inconsistencies matching those I had presented live. Approval logs modified after submission, transfers authorized outside standard compliance windows, and legal fast-tracking without documented risk assessment. None of it constituted cinematic fraud, it constituted procedural manipulation layered enough to redirect liability. The distinction was critical. Corporations rarely collapse from a single illegal act, they erode from calculated shortcuts disguised as strategy. The board's second emergency session extended into the early hours of the morning. By sunrise, a brief statement was released announcing that Tyler Kingston would step aside pending completion of the audit. The language was restrained, but the implication was seismic. Markets stabilized almost immediately, not because guilt had been declared, but because oversight had been acknowledged. Brandon Cole resigned 2 days later, citing personal reasons. Christian Wells transitioned representation to outside counsel. Derek Sullivan scheduled internal ethics training sessions that employees attended with careful neutrality. The machinery of corporate survival had engaged fully. Through it all, I remained publicly silent. That silence was not passivity, it was discipline. Any appearance of gloating would reframe the story as personal vindication rather than structural correction. When media outlets requested interviews, I declined extended commentary, offering only a brief written statement. Transparency protects institutions and the people within them. The phrase circulated widely, not because it was dramatic, but because it contrasted sharply with the spectacle of the summit. One evening, Trevor Hayes called again, his tone reflective rather than investigative. "You realize," he said, "that this has shifted the conversation beyond your case." He was right. Analysts were now discussing governance reforms, metadata accountability, and executive communication transparency. The story had evolved from one man's humiliation into a case study on narrative control in corporate crises. That evolution mattered more than personal reputation ever could. A week after Tyler stepped aside, Logan invited me to meet with the board informally. I entered the same building from which I had once exited in silence, but this time there were no cameras, no slides, no orchestrated applause. The boardroom was quiet, heavy with deliberation rather than performance. Logan spoke first. "The audit confirms that internal warnings were raised and not incorporated into public reporting." He did not apologize, institutions rarely do. Instead, he acknowledged sequence. "We misjudged the timeline." That admission was enough. I did not request reinstatement. I did not negotiate conditions. I simply outlined procedural safeguards that could prevent similar distortions in the future: independent timestamp verification, audit triggers for after-hours approvals, separation of compliance reporting from executive narrative framing. They listened. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with recalibration. As I left, I understood something fundamental: exposure alone does not transform systems. Structured correction does. Tyler's removal was not the climax of the story, it was a symptom of accountability finally aligning with documentation. Outside the building, the city moved as it always had, traffic flowing, headlines updating, conversations shifting. Public humiliation had once defined my name in those spaces. Now, the discourse surrounding it had matured into something larger. The reversal was not explosive, it was deliberate. Tyler had used spectacle to compress truth into accusation. The audit expanded it back into sequence. In the quiet that followed the board meeting, I reflected on how easily narratives solidify when unchallenged and how difficult, yet essential, it is to dismantle them with patience rather than rage. It was not about revenge fulfilled, it was about consequence unfolding. It demonstrated that composure under accusation can outlast performance under applause, and that documentation, when preserved with integrity, eventually compels examination. The summit stage had introduced me as the liability. The live broadcast had introduced context. The audit introduced consequence. And consequence, once formalized, does not require theatrics to be understood. The invitation to return arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, months after the audit report had been finalized and the headlines had settled into archived links, and when I saw the location listed at the top of the message, the Grand Crescent Summit Hall, I allowed myself a slow breath before reading further. The same hall where my face had once filled a screen beneath the words "Primary Responsible Party" was now hosting an annual leadership conference under a different theme: Institutional Transparency and Structural Reform. The board, newly restructured and publicly committed to governance changes, wanted me to deliver the keynote. Not as a reinstated executive. Not as a symbol of redemption. But as a case study in composure, documentation, and structural accountability. The symmetry was undeniable. I did not accept immediately. Instead, I walked to the window of my office. My office, not in the old building, but in a modest yet growing consulting firm I had established in the weeks following the audit's conclusion. I had chosen not to return to the company after Tyler Kingston formally resigned and Brandon Cole's departure was quietly processed through corporate filings. Logan Price had extended the option, acknowledging that my record had been cleared and my internal warnings validated. But restoration did not interest me as much as autonomy. Sterling Advisory Group began as a single desk, a single client who valued process integrity, and a single principle: structure before spectacle. Word travels quickly in professional circles when documentation withstands scrutiny, and within months, organizations seeking compliance restructuring and audit readiness were requesting consultations. Reputation, once fractured, had reassembled not through defense but through demonstration. When I finally accepted the keynote invitation, it was not to close a personal but to frame a broader lesson. The evening of the conference, the chandeliers reflected light just as they had months earlier, but the atmosphere felt different, not because the architecture had changed, but because perception had matured. As I stood backstage waiting for my introduction, I did not feel triumph. I felt clarity. The host's voice echoed through the hall, referencing the audit reforms, the policy shifts, and the industry conversation sparked by what had unfolded. When my name was called, the applause was steady, not explosive, and I walked to the podium with the same measured pace I had maintained during the live broadcast that altered the narrative. I did not begin by revisiting humiliation. I began with sequence. I spoke about the architecture of accountability, about how small procedural shortcuts accumulate into narrative distortions, about the difference between leadership that prioritizes optics and leadership that prioritizes verification. I described how metadata, timestamps, and internal warnings are not bureaucratic inconveniences but safeguards against misdirected blame. I did not mention Tyler by name. His story had already concluded in public filings and board statements. Instead, I focused on the lesson that institutions do not fail because of isolated errors, they falter when documentation is curated to protect hierarchy rather than truth. As I spoke, I noticed faces in the audience not reflecting sympathy but concentration. That was the shift. The story had transcended personality. It had become instructional. I concluded the keynote with a simple assertion: transparency is not reactive. It is structural. When structure is strong, spectacle is unnecessary. The applause that followed carried a different energy than the scattered clapping of the summit months earlier. It was not relief, it was acknowledgement. After the conference, professionals approached not to congratulate but to inquire, about audit frameworks, about internal reporting safeguards, about separating compliance from executive narrative. That was the true reversal. The humiliation that once defined my name had transformed into a reference point for reform. Later that night, as the hall emptied and the staff dismantled equipment, I stood alone near the stage for a moment. The same LED screen that had once displayed my face beneath accusation now showed the conference logo against a neutral backdrop. I realized then that closure is rarely loud. It does not arrive with vindication speeches or public apologies. It arrives quietly when the lesson outweighs the wound. It was never about revenge completed, it was about direction chosen. I had the option to anchor my identity to injustice, to retell the humiliation as the defining moment of my career. Instead, I anchored it to discipline. To the decision made in the corridor outside that ballroom months ago, when I resolved not to argue in shadows but to respond with documentation under light. That decision shaped everything that followed: the live broadcast, the audit, the structural reforms, the consulting firm now expanding beyond a single office. Connor Blake, who once nervously questioned midnight timestamps, now worked as a senior analyst within a compliance division at another firm, recommended quietly through networks that valued integrity. Trevor Hayes continued investigative reporting, occasionally referencing the case as an example of narrative scrutiny. Logan Price remained on the board, overseeing policy changes that required independent audit triggers for after-hours approvals. The ripple effect extended further than any single resignation. As I left the hall that night, stepping into the cool air beneath a skyline that looked unchanged yet felt redefined, I understood the full arc of the story. Public humiliation had been the spark, documentation the fuel, exposure the ignition, consequence the transformation, and reform the outcome. People often believe justice is theatrical, that it demands confrontation and dramatic confession. In reality, justice often resembles alignment, the slow, methodical correction of a distorted timeline until facts settle into their proper order. The summary of this journey is not that a man was shamed and then vindicated, it is that structure, when preserved with discipline, outlasts spectacle. The conclusion is not that villains fall and heroes rise, it is that systems improve when individuals refuse to surrender accuracy to narrative pressure. I was once introduced to an audience as the liability. I returned as a consultant on resilience not because I shouted louder, but because I documented carefully. That is the thread carrying this story forward. Not the applause, not the headlines, not the resignation letters, but the understanding that truth does not rush. It waits. And when given a stage equal to the one that misrepresented it, it does not need to dramatize itself. It simply stands.